Welcome to the Institute for Spirituality and Health. Today we are going to be honored to hear from Amy McGuire. Dr. Amy McGuire is the Associate Professor of Medicine at Baylor College of Medicine. She is also Professor of Medical Ethics at the Center for Medical Ethics and Health Policy at Baylor. She received her BA degree in psychology, summa cum laude, at the University of Pennsylvania in 1995. Her JD, summa cum laude, from the University of Houston in 2000. And her PhD in Medical Humanities with distinction from the Institute for the Medical Humanities at University of Texas Medical Branch in 2004. Her topic today is genomic medicine, ethical, legal, and social implications. Please give a warm welcome to Amy McGuire. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here. So I was asked to talk today about an area that I do a lot of research on, which is genomic medicine and the clinical integration of genomic technologies. And I thought I would start by kind of bringing us back to thinking about genetics from a historical perspective, because a lot of attention has been paid in recent years to the ethical, legal, and social implications of genomics. And one of the reasons that we're so concerned about the ethical issues as they arise in the context of genomics is because of the history that it's coming from with genetics and the eugenics movement. So the doctrine of eugenics was really combining social Darwinism with Mendelian theories of heredity. And advocates saw that eugenics as a way to perfect the human gene pool by influencing the reproductive process, and some scientists advocated that it could keep the Anglo-American race kind of pure. And a lot of people associate eugenics with World War II and Germany and the Hitler regime, but actually the eugenics movement was quite large in the United States prior to being adopted in Germany. So from 1907 onwards, at least 60,000 Americans were sterilized against their will under the legal basis of eugenics laws. In 1927, there was a very famous United States Supreme Court case called Buck versus Bell. And in this case, the Supreme Court affirmed the constitutionality of Virginia's sterilization laws. So there were many states at the time that had laws that called for the forced sterilization of individuals who had particular types of mental illnesses, epilepsy, different sorts of conditions that were considered to be unpure and that that were thought to kind of create an impure human race. And in this very, very famous quote by Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, he said, "It's better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for a crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind." And then he says, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. And that was the justification for upholding these sterilization laws in many states. Eugenics was also very much deeply embedded in U.S. pop culture in the 1920s and 1930s. So these are all images from the Kansas State Fair in the 1920s. And it shows here a eugenics and health exhibit that they had. They had this Better Baby contest where they would examine your child and see sort of who represented the best Anglo-American representation of what our pure race should look like. And they also had contests for the Fitter Family exhibit where your family could get evaluated to see who was sort of the most fit family from a Darwinist and Mendelian perspective. So 30 U.S. states had adapted eugenics laws by the early 1930s, and most compulsory sterilizations occurred in the 30s and 40s. There were some laws like Virginia's that continued and stayed on the books until the 1970s, although the practice of forced sterilization was not practiced as frequently in the later years. In the 1940s, the theory of eugenics really came under strong criticisms, obviously because of its racial prejudices and lack of scientific foundation, and most of the laws were abandoned in the United States in the 1950s. However, as I mentioned, Germany really was influenced, the German laws on eugenics were really influenced by this precedent set in the United States, and Hitler very much ascribed to following the U.S. eugenic legislation in his entire office. And he's had several quotes that talk about his interest in eugenics. This first one says, "I've studied with great interest the laws of several American states concerning prevention of reproduction by people whose progeny would, in all probability, be of no value or be injurious to the racial stock." He also said, "If I can send the flower of the German nation into the hell of war without the smallest pity for the shedding of precious German blood, then surely I have the right to remove millions of an inferior race that breeds like vermin." And this was sort of the philosophy behind the eugenics movement that gave genetics really kind of a bad name. It really kind of engendered this idea that there was a fear once this passed and people realized that eugenics was not a socially acceptable and fairly dangerous philosophy to have. I think that has continued in the field of genetics and has influenced sort of the investment that we put into studying the ethical, legal, and social issues in genetics. However, as starting with sort of Watson and Crick's discovery of the structure of DNA, the science of genetics has really blossomed over the last 50 years. And I think there's also a positive side to genetics that we see now in a lot of pop culture in the last 20 years or so in the United States. And I think it's summarized very well in this New York Times article that was written actually in 1989. And if you read this, you might think it was written this week or last month or something, because it's a very, it might have been futuristic then, but it's still a little bit futuristic now. So it says, "In the not-so-distant future, we can expect to walk into a physician's office for an annual physical and walk out with a blueprint of our genetic inheritance and with the knowledge of the most likely cause of our own death." And I think this really represents sort of what is seen now as the promise of genetics and what we're hoping to accomplish with when we hear terms like personalized medicine and personalized genomic medicine. So this is a slide that really depicts how the technology has evolved over the last decade. And you can see up here in the corner, there's a picture. These are all sequencing machines. This is the technology that's used to read our DNA and to tell us what our genetic makeup is. So in the upper left corner, you see a picture of very large sequencing machines. These are the machines that were used to complete the Human Genome Project. And the Human Genome Project was a massive international effort to try to create a reference genome. So they took samples from multiple people around the world, and they tried to just figure out what does the human genome look like in its entirety. It took 13 years to complete. It took almost $3 billion to complete the sequencing of the human genome. It was a massive effort. The technology has advanced so rapidly that in 2007, the first individual human genomes were sequenced. And this was one person who gave their blood, and it was analyzed, and we could get an entire readout of what that person's genome looked like. One of the first genomes that was sequenced was that of Jim Watson, who incidentally was one of the co-discoverers of the structure of DNA, so it was very appropriate. His genome was sequenced by a company called 454 Life Sciences using their sequencing technology. As you can see, it becomes much smaller and more compact. It was analyzed at Baylor in our Human Genome Sequencing Center, and it took about a month and about $1 million to sequence his genome. Now, of course, it takes a lot longer to try to figure out what that sequence means in terms of his health and different traits, but the sequencing took about a month. In 2009, a company called Complete Genomics out of California announced that it could sequence an entire genome for under $5,000 using much smaller technology. The cost and the time that it takes to sequence the genome depends somewhat on the depth of coverage that you're looking for, but this is getting a fairly good quality genome sequenced in a fairly rapid time. This year we've seen even greater advances in the technology. Ion Torrent is a company that's come out, and they have said by this summer they can sequence an entire genome on this tiny little handheld device for $1,000 in one day. And Nanopore is a company out of the UK that announced just in the last month that they have a USB sequencer that can sequence an entire genome fairly quickly, within a day or a couple hours. So you can see the technology here has really dramatically increased. The cost of sequencing has also dramatically decreased. So whereas it cost almost $13 billion in 2001 to complete the Human Genome Project, now you can see we're almost at that 1,000 genome mark. And this has really pushed kind of the clinical integration of genomics forward, because it has become within reach to imagine the feasibility of sequencing individuals in the clinical setting. So this is a graph from the NHGRI strategic plan, and the NHGRI is an institute at the NIH that funds genomics, and they also fund the ethical, legal, and social implications studies of genomics. And this is their strategic plan that they recently came out with, and it's a little bit small up there, I don't know if you can see it, but basically the big plots show where they see sort of the science going. And while we were doing the Human Genome Project, we were really focusing, the entire institute was focusing on understanding the structure of the genome. And we've moved more recently into understanding the biology of genomes. We're starting to move a little bit, and I think they anticipate spending more time on understanding the biology of disease. And the goal is to eventually move to advancing the science of medicine and improving the effectiveness of healthcare. So there's really this idea that we're going to be able to use genomic medicine to improve healthcare in the future. This is a slide that just shows what we've done at Baylor in our human genome sequencing lab in terms of sequencing individual genomes and where we've come in the last couple of years. So you can see at the slide, and this slide was provided by my colleagues Jim Lepsky and Richard Gibbs. And you can see at the top of the slide here, Jim Watson, who I mentioned, we sequenced his entire genome. The purpose of that project was really to get a sense of what is the individual variation in the genome. We have sort of a reference of what the typical genome might look like. Now we're interested in how do individuals vary in terms of the variants that they have across the genome. In 2010, they published a paper that was showing the sequence of Desmond Tutu and several others, individuals in Africa, and they were looking really at population variation. In 2010, Jim Lepsky, who's a very well-known geneticist at Baylor, sequenced himself, and he has a genetic condition that he's been studying in his lab for 20, 30 years. He has Charcot-Marie-Tooth syndrome, and he's never been able to identify the causative genes in his family. And through whole genome sequencing, he was able to identify the medically actionable disease-causing variants in his own familial case of this disease. And most recently, in 2011, we published a paper on the Beery twins, and these are individuals, twins who were born with a medical condition. They were mismanaged for many years because it wasn't clear exactly what was going on with them, and they were misdiagnosed for many years. And then they came to the Genome Center and they got whole genome sequenced, and they were actually able to identify the genes that were causing their disease and actually change their medical management on the basis of what they found and improve their health quite substantially. So you can see sort of the evolution of where we've come in terms of our ability to use genomics to integrate with healthcare and improve health. Baylor recently opened its whole exome sequencing lab, its whole genome lab, and where they do whole exome sequencing, and this is the first clinically certified whole genome, whole exome laboratory at an academic medical center. There are other clinically certified labs, some of them at industry. And so they're now processing samples and doing whole exome sequencing on individuals, and I think they've gotten over 100 samples that they've processed and analyzed. And most recently, the NIH has invested quite a bit of money in funding research projects that are looking at the clinical integration of genomics. So these are called Clinical Sequencing Exploratory Research Grants. They're funding many other research initiatives as well, but this is one that I happen to be working a lot on, so I wanted to mention it. And really what these grants are doing is they're having individuals identify patient populations, do whole genome or whole exome sequencing on them, where they're looking across their entire genome at all the coding genes or all the genes in general if you're doing whole genome sequencing, and then interpreting that information, bringing it back to the patient in a clinical setting and seeing how it might impact their clinical care. A big component of those projects is also studying the psychosocial impact and the ethics of doing this, and so we've been working with two of these groups on looking at the psychosocial impact and ethics of integrating whole genome and whole exome sequencing. There's also an industry that's developed over the last couple of years where companies are popped up where they're offering genetic sequencing to individuals directly without having to go through a healthcare provider. So this is called direct-to-consumer personal genome testing, and what it is probably the most well-known one is 23andMe. Have you guys heard of 23andMe or any of these companies?
Heard of it? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So what you do here is they send you a spit kit and you send in a saliva sample. They use a SNP chip where they're looking at about 1,000 different disease-causing variants across your genome, and then they report back the information to you online, and you can go on and search and see sort of what's your risk of getting different diseases, which sort of your population risk of different kinds of traits. There have been several companies that have popped up. Navigenics is one of them, although Navigenics is now moved away from the direct-to-consumer model. They're doing more going through healthcare providers. Biomarker is another one. A couple of years ago, 23andMe was named the Invention of the Year, their spit kit in Time magazine, so it's gotten a lot of publicity and a lot of attention. And these tests are kind of interesting because they provide a variety of different types of information to consumers. So they provide you a lot of information about your ancestry, which is quite interesting to a lot of people, and there's a huge group of followers who are interested in genealogy. They provide recreational traits, so they'll tell you, I consider them recreational traits because they're things that are not really medically relevant. Some people find them fun. They'll tell you if you have different genetic predispositions to having a lot of earwax. You probably know already if you have a lot of earwax, but it'll tell you if you're predisposed to that, predisposed to bitter taste, different things that you can think of as being genetic. And then they also provide disease risk information. So they'll tell you your risk of developing Alzheimer's disease based on the latest scientific data that we have. Diabetes, asthma, cancer, Parkinson's, heart disease. So a lot of different types of diseases, conditions, and they're looking at genetic variants that have varying levels of varying penetrance. And what that means is for some of the genes they're looking at, it'll increase your risk, but really only very, very slightly. For other things, it might increase your risk a lot more. These companies have really tried to maintain the position that they're not sort of providing you with medical information. They consider what they're providing you just more recreational information. And so they say we don't provide medical advice, and the services that they provide can't be used for health ascertainment or disease purposes. This is from 23andMe's terms of services, where they say reliance on any information provided is solely at your own risk. They advise consumers that if they have questions, then they should go talk to their physician or some other healthcare professional about it. The problem is that most physicians are getting advice that you shouldn't actually counsel patients on the basis of this information because they don't know the validity of it, they don't know how the test was done, and so it would be difficult for them to actually counsel patients on the basis of this. So it leaves kind of consumers who are getting this direct-to-consumer testing done with being unclear about who might actually help them interpret those results. We've done some research that has suggested that at least some consumers might expect their physicians to help them interpret the results, and that some that we surveyed felt that physicians had an ethical obligation to help patients interpret the results when they get them through these companies. So there was a lot of controversy. There's been a lot of controversy about these direct-to-consumer companies since they started in 2007. But in the summer of 2010, there was quite a bit of controversy around this. And there were several things that kind of happened around the same time that created this controversy. One was that Berkeley, UC Berkeley decided that they were going to offer genetic testing for all their incoming freshmen. And they were going to have like a seminar around this. So they were going to test them for a couple different traits, their susceptibility to metabolize alcohol, a couple different things. And then they were going to have this seminar, and they were going to talk about their genetic results, and they thought it would be really fun. And this got into a lot of public controversy because people thought that this wasn't done in kind of a good way, and that freshmen who were coming in and received a letter from their institution that they were going to might feel pressure to do this even if they didn't want to do it, etc. At the same time, there were some schools like Stanford that were offering genetic testing to their students. At Stanford, they offered a course to their graduate students that would allow them to genotype their own data through a company like 23andMe or one of the direct-to-consumer companies, and then they could analyze the data as part of this genetics course that they were taking. The third thing that happened kind of that summer, and this all happened around in May, was that one of the companies called Pathway Genomics decided that they were going to sell their spit kit in Walgreens across the country. So rather than calling them and ordering a test and them sending you something through the mail, they were going to put it on the shelves in the Walgreens, and then you would go to their website and sign up to actually get your sample analyzed. And this really raised a lot of attention and got the FDA kind of up in arms. And so what happened was the FDA responded by sending letters to all of these different companies saying, you're not regulated by the FDA. We think this is a medical device, and tell us why you're not regulated or shouldn't be regulated. And so there has been tremendous controversy over the last 2 years about what degree of regulation we should have for these genetic tests. Should individuals be able to buy this test online, see their own genetic information, explore it? And a lot of people argue that they should, that they have a right to see that information, that it's their information, and they should do whatever they want with it. Other people have argued that this is medical information and you should only be able to obtain it in a healthcare setting with a physician who can help explain it in the context of your family history and your other environmental exposures you may have. And some countries, including Germany, have banned the use of direct-to-consumer genetic testing, and so you have to go through a health care provider in those countries. The FDA has not resolved this issue. They're still considering how to regulate this industry, and they haven't quite come to a resolution yet. You can see that of the over 1,500 genetic tests that are available in the United States, only a few dozen are actually reviewed and approved by the FDA. And so they haven't had a heavy hand in regulating genetic testing in the past, but this is now certainly an issue for the future. And the things that they're worried about when they're looking at sort of the safety and efficacy of these tests is whether the tests are valid. So are they telling you what they tell you they're telling you? Are they telling you sort of not only is they're looking for this genetic variant and they find this genetic variant, but they're telling you that this genetic variant is associated with increased risk of disease, and it actually is associated with increased risk of disease. And that's been very controversial because it depends on how you interpret the scientific evidence. And you can go to different companies and you might get slightly different results in the interpretation. So they might both say you have this variant, but interpret what that means for your health very differently. There's also a lot of controversy around the utility of this information, about whether it's going to actually improve people's health care, how they're going to use it in a medical setting. And there's been a lot of controversy about the access to accurate and truthful information. So the Government Accountability Office has done 2 different investigations of these direct-to-consumer companies. And they have found that in some of the things that they have put out there, their advertisements were not actually accurate, that there were some ethical problems with how they were selling their services. For example, the latest investigation, they had fake customers who sent in fake samples and got their results back. And they found not only that did they get different results from different companies, but when they called the company representatives, for example, one fake customer called one of the companies and said, "I'm thinking about surprising my fiance with this test. Can I surreptitiously take his saliva, send it in, and surprise him with his results?" And that would obviously be an invasion of somebody's privacy. The company said, "Oh, that's a great idea. You should totally do that. What a great gift." So those are the sorts of things that got the Government Accountability Office concerned and really led to sort of this further investigation of how to regulate these companies. So now I'm going to switch a little bit into genomic medicine and kind of the clinical integration of these technologies and talk a little bit about a couple of the ethical issues that have really been most salient in this area. So I think one of the big issues, one of the biggest issues in genetics is public perceptions about what genetics is and misperceptions about what genetics is. And a lot of this is you can sort of figure out what the public knows based on how it's presented in the popular media. So I love Time magazine covers because they kind of put the pulse on the American people and tell you sort of how is information being communicated to the American public. And for many years, they were really talking about genetics in a very reductionistic perspective. And I think that's how a lot of people think about genetics if you just go to the regular person on the street. So you would see covers of Time magazines like this, the IQ gene, which suggests that there's one gene in your body that can tell you if you're going to have a high IQ or a low IQ. And anybody who works in genetics knows that it's much, much more complicated than that. And that's obviously a very...
Is this what you want us to be seeing?
Yes.
Okay.
No, that's not what I want you to be seeing.
Do you have any more slides?
I do have more slides.
Okay.
Do you know why this is happening?
Yeah, because I don't think you're shining one up, are you?
Yes.
You are?
Uh-huh.
Right now?
I know why it's happening because this came out.
Oh. Oh.
I know what's happening.
Oh, that's probably it.
So what do I have to do?
I may have to turn it off and turn it back on.
There it goes. See it?
Oh.
There it goes. Okay.
Okay.
So this is the Time magazine cover. That makes a lot more sense, I'm sure, than what you were seeing. Thank you, Tom. In terms of the IQ gene. They've also had things like infidelity. It may be in our genes, right? So it's suggesting that, you know, that is a trait that you can inherit. I actually had one of the funnier comments after I gave a talk one time and I showed the slide. That's right. I couldn't help it. So one of the funnier comments I had after I gave a talk and showed the slide one time is somebody came up and they said, you know, I'm sorry, but infidelity is, it's not what's in your genes, but what's out of your genes that matters. That's cute. And even the God gene. So this is the suggestion that, you know, how spiritual you are.
Huh. I wonder what. That's all.
There you go.
Is it there? Okay. Thank you. So this is the God gene. So it tells you, you know, if you have a particular genetic predisposition, you could be more religious or less religious or more spiritual, which again is a ridiculous concept, but this is how the genetics, the concept of genetics is being portrayed to the American public. I was actually really pleased that about a year or so ago, I saw a cover of a Time magazine article that really was kind of changing this perception of genetics. It says, why your DNA isn't your destiny, and it's an entire article about the whole field of epigenetics and how there are epigenetic modifiers that change sort of our genetic destiny, and how it's much, much more complicated than just a single gene causing a particular trait or a particular disease. Another major issue in the area of genetics and genomics has to do with the psychosocial impact of receiving genetic information. So a lot of the information that you can get when you get your genome sequenced has to do with future risks of developing disease in the future, and sometimes these diseases might be incurable, they might be untreatable, they might be non-preventable. So things like Alzheimer's disease or Huntington's disease, and you may have a predisposition to one of those, and based on your genetics, it can tell you whether either in the case of Huntington's disease, whether you're going to get the disease or not. In the case of Alzheimer's, it tells you sort of whether you have an increased risk of getting the disease. And a big concern in the literature and sort of hypothetically has been, are people going to freak out when they get this information? Are they going to get totally anxious? Are they going to get distressed? Is it going to cause them psychosocial harm? And we've just started to explore how people do respond to this information. We've been in a position recently to kind of look at that. And so there's been a couple studies that have done this. The first kind of big study was done in the case of Alzheimer's disease, and that's not this study, but it was a group that looked at people who were at risk of getting Alzheimer's disease, and they did testing for the APOE gene, which increases your risk of Alzheimer's disease, and then they tested the psychosocial response. So did they get distressed? Did they get depressed? Did they get anxious? And they found that not really. They got a little bit anxious initially, and then over time they went back to baseline. This was a more recent study that was done with individuals who were using some of those direct-to-consumer genetic tests. This one in particular was studying consumers from the company Navigenics. And it was a fairly large sample, and they were looking at how did they respond to the test results that they were getting from this company Navigenics. And what they basically found was that there were no significant differences found in the level of anxiety, dietary fat intake, or exercise behavior between baseline and follow-up. So before they got tested and after they got tested, they did not increase their anxiety, and they did not change their behaviors that much either. So the flip side of genetics is if they get this information, everyone's going to be motivated to have a healthier lifestyle, to eat better, to exercise, and this shows that, not surprisingly, there isn't that much of a motivation, or people actually don't follow through with that motivation. A third major concern has to do with how people are going to follow up with this information. So if you get a result about a genetic predisposition to disease, the inclination might be to go through a bunch of follow-up diagnostic tests, to go through potential procedures, and there's concern that this might lead to the overutilization of healthcare resources and might also cause iatrogenic harms. So any sort of screening procedures you go through, most medical tests that you do, carry some risk of harm with them. And so if we start increasing the use of those resources, the concern is that you're going to actually cause harm to the patients for doing tests that were not indicated or not necessary because they're getting information back that they want to act on. There is really no good data about whether this in fact happens or will happen. We are just starting to study this now through those clinical sequencing grants, where they're actually looking at how do people respond to the information that they're getting back through whole genome and whole exome sequencing, and particularly, are they going to the doctor more? Are they getting more screening tests? Are they doing preventive treatments? Are they taking more medications? Are they starting to take more vitamins and supplements and other types of therapies that might not be prescribed, but that they can get over the counter, etc. So we're trying to track those behaviors and see what the result is. Finally, the last issue I wanted to bring up deals with genomic privacy. And this has been a big issue all along. Because your genetic information is unique to you, there's a lot of concerns about sort of your privacy associated with people getting access to your genetic information, and concerns about genetic discrimination. And there's been a huge debate for a very long time about whether we should have heightened protections for genetic information in the healthcare system, outside of the healthcare system. And some people argue genetics is no different from anything else. It's just like other types of medical information. Other people argue it is different. It runs in your family. It's something that changes a little bit over time, but really the basis of it doesn't change over time, and it uniquely identifies you. And so there has been a lot of discussion about providing enhanced protections for privacy in the genetic arena. And in 2008, there was a federal law that was passed that had been lobbied for about 7 years, called the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. And this is a law that protects individuals against genetic discrimination by health insurers and employers. So there's now a federal law in the United States that health insurers and employers can't use genetic information, which gives you a risk of developing future disease, in order to make decisions about coverage or reimbursement in the health insurance and employment realm. It doesn't cover individuals in the context of things like life insurance, disability, and things like that. So it's not a comprehensive anti-discrimination piece of legislation, but it's one step in the direction of providing protection in this area. So I just want to end by kind of thinking about where we're going with this. And I've been studying genetic privacy and thinking about issues in genetic privacy for a very, very long time. And I think that this whole conversation about genetic privacy is likely to shift, at least among the younger generation, as technologies continue to advance. So this is a photo that shows sort of all of the social networking sites that are out there and their share buttons. And I think sort of this culture of social networking, which is fascinating, is really going to change how people think about their information, including their genetic information, and their willingness to share very private things. So I know that, I'm on Facebook. I don't quite tweet yet on Twitter, but I know a lot of people do. And I'm sometimes, even myself, amazed at what people are willing to share on Facebook for the whole world to see. I guess I'm going to be on YouTube, so that's another example. But there's all these things where we share our information, our very, very private information, when we do online banking, when we use credit cards, when we go on things like Facebook and other social networking sites, when we blog. People blog and put these like very personal things out there in the public sphere. And I think that there are many people who think that genetics is just going to be another piece of that. Some of the direct-to-consumer companies like 23andMe have talked about social networking on the basis of your genome. So you might want to hook up with other people who have similar genetic predispositions as you do and create a community around that. There's certainly communities. There's a site called Patients Like Me where you can hook up with other people that have similar genetic predispositions and explanations for disease, and you can have a community around that, and a social support system. And so I think that sort of the wave of the future is going to be one of much more openness around genetic and genomic information, and that'll have really interesting sort of ripple effects in terms of how we treat and deal with some of these ethical issues around genetics and genomics in the healthcare setting. So I will end with that and open it up for discussion or questions. Or
yeah.
I found this very helpful because I really didn't know very much about what you were doing. But I'm also not sure what analogies could be drawn to what this screen does to other things. Mm-hmm. When they first did HIV testing, questions of privacy and so forth, and what was the public interest. Is that similar, or is it dissimilar? What makes this distinctive?
Well, HIV testing is similar in the sort of sensitivity of the issue, I think.
Right.
And I think there are a lot of, and that's the argument against genetic exceptionalism, right? So there's all these other things like HIV and things like that that are socially stigmatizing that we should have equal protections for. Genetics, I think, is slightly different, only because your genetics, so if you have somebody's positive HIV test and you have no other information about them, you don't know who it came from. If you have somebody's genome and you have no other information about them, you might be able to figure out whose genome that is. And it tells you not just about sort of one thing, like if they get their genome sequenced because they're a patient who has a rare form of heart disease and they're getting sequenced for that purpose, it doesn't just tell you about their heart disease, it tells you about everything else in their genome. So it's kind of broad in that sense. It also tells you about their family. So it tells you that their parents and their children and their siblings might have some risk of developing the types of diseases that they have. And so it gives, kind of clan genomics, it gives sort of information about individuals within their clan, within their close biological relatives. So in that sense, it is a little bit different. Whether that justifies a different response legislatively or whether it creates different issues ethically, I think is a subject of a lot of debate.
And if you were head of the FDA, what would you recommend?
So I have an article that you can read that tells exactly what I'd recommend.
You send it to me?
Yes. So I think it's particularly difficult for the FDA, especially especially with these direct-to-consumer companies, because they're giving out such different types of information. So how you regulate ancestry information should be very different than how you regulate information about somebody's BRCA mutation, which significantly increases their risk of getting breast and ovarian cancer. Yet they're all packed together in one test, and you can't split apart the test and regulate components of the test differently necessarily. I also think it's very difficult for the pre-market approval process for these tests because the long-term effectiveness and sort of the impact that it's going to have on medical care is unknown, and it will take a very long time to gather those data. And so we've actually advocated for more post-market surveillance to make sure that there are no adverse events, that the data that's coming out about psychosocial impact isn't wrong and people don't get harmed by receiving this information, et cetera. I also think that because the test is complicated by having so many different components to it, the discussion about whether it should be offered direct to consumer or not is very complicated. So there are certain things, certain medical tests that are sort of bundled within the direct to consumer personal genome services that I do think it would be wise to have a genetic counselor or a physician available to put those results into context. But there are other things that I think are perfectly safe for people to play around with and have fun with, and there would be no harm in receiving that information directly from a company. So it's not an easy task, which is why there still hasn't been a resolution after exploring it.
Used to be that you'd check for chromosomes through amniocentesis. Mm-hmm. Is there using these genomic tests for that purpose as well?
Yep. So right now they're not doing a whole lot of whole exome and whole genome sequencing prenatally, but they're using microarrays, which is a very large genome-wide type technology in the prenatal setting. And there was actually a very large study, I think, with 6 different sites that was looking at comparing microarray technologies with the traditional technologies of doing prenatal testing, and I think they're just publishing their results that microarray technologies, were found to be a better way of doing the testing. So yes, that is being used. It also raises a lot of interesting issues because you get a lot more information with the microarrays than you do with the older technologies.
You don't solve the penetrance problem.
No.
You give the information, there's a gene, but
you don't solve the penetrance problem. You also don't solve the problem that they often will find things with unknown significance. So they may find like segments of the genome that are missing or that are duplicated, and they don't really know what that means because it hasn't been studied in that region. And so they'll do confirmatory testing with the parents, and I think sometimes if the parents have the same mutation, then they consider it to be non-pathogenic, but they can't say for certain, and so there's a lot of issues around communicating that back to parents and helping them make decisions on the basis of information that's not entirely clear. Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know, I can't generalize this, but different examples of knowing about Huntington's or Alzheimer's that you mentioned here with the anxiety that might come from knowing that, and BRCA. I've seen some patients who don't want to know if they have breast cancer, and they don't want to know if they have BRCA, and they refuse to have the test done.
Mm-hmm.
How do you approach these different populations? Huntington's, I could see being anxious about it, because if you've got it, many of those folks commit suicide, as you know, in their 50s once the disease manifests.
Yep. So this is a big issue. There's a long tradition in genetics of respecting the right not to know information. And I think we're just starting to try to work it out. One of the problems is you don't know necessarily what you're going to find, and so it would be impossible up front to say, do you want to know A, B, C, D, E? People have tried to start to categorize information in different ways. Would you want to know about something that we can't treat or prevent? Would you want to know about something that we're not sure sort of what the clinical significance of it is? So trying to get people to make decisions that way. There's a really, really fascinating field in health psychology of behavioral economics of how people process information and make decisions. And from that literature, I think it would suggest it's really difficult up front, hypothetically, to be able to say what you think you want and what you think you don't want when you don't know what that information is going to be. But you're absolutely right. In clinical genetic testing, I mean, most people say, I want everything, but the uptake of genetic testing is not as high. So a lot of people don't actually get genetic tests. There's been a couple studies in the research context where they've asked research participants, would you want back all the information that we find out from your genetic analysis? And when you ask people, I've got information about you, would you want it? Most likely they say yes, without any level of granularity in that. So I think people are now starting to try to fine-tune that and say, do you really want all the information? Let's give you some more examples and see if you really think you want this. And then if you think you want it and we give it to you, do you still want it? Are you glad you got it? Those sorts of things. So those are the kinds of questions and the issues that are being studied now. It's the kind of stuff that we're working on as well. But they're not easy questions. Yeah.
What's happening to our ideas about privacy? It looks like people are less concerned about maintaining privacy, especially younger people, with social networking. I know Cheryl Irwin's done some research on privacy and Huntington's disease in certain populations. So is it shifting? Are we less, as a culture, are we less concerned about privacy? And if so, how should that affect the ethics in law?
So I don't know the answer to that sort of on a population level, because I don't know anybody that's actually looked at historical trends and now like looking at how people feel about privacy. I think there is tremendous individual variation in how people feel about it. I think a lot of people voluntarily give up their privacy in ways that they don't realize, right? So, or they may know, but to me it's really about not just how much do we care about privacy, but what's the risk-benefit trade-off that we're making in terms of our privacy. So we actually did this study. We were talking to people about who were entering genetic studies, and they were, as part of the genetic study, they were agreeing to have their genetic information released into databases that had some privacy risks associated with it. And we asked them about releasing their genetic information to databases that were available on the internet and releasing them into sort of scientific databases that were more controlled, right? And we asked them we surveyed them, and we asked them, this is a small group of patients sort of in the Houston area, so it's definitely not generalizable, but we asked them, we said, how much do you care about your privacy? And almost all of them said, I care a lot about my privacy. I said, how much do you care about advancing research? And almost all of them said, I care a lot about advancing research. And what we were finding is that they were talking about their privacy, they were worried about their privacy. We would talk to them for 45 minutes. They would talk about, I don't know, I care about my privacy, I don't know about the public getting access to this information. And then in the end, they would consent to and agree to releasing their data completely into the public domain. And we're like, what is going on here? Are they not understanding what we're doing? So partway through the survey, we decided to add a question that says, if you had to pick, what do you care about more, your privacy or advancing research? And the majority of people said advancing research. So I don't think it's easy enough to say, do people care about their privacy? Everybody cares about their privacy. But I care about my privacy. I care more about connecting with my friends on Facebook. You know, I care about my privacy, but I care more about the ease at which I can buy things over the internet with my credit card, you know? So I think it's this trade-off, and I think how that plays out in the area of genetics is yet to be seen.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah.
Probably different than it was 50 years ago, too. Yes, the same questions.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I'm sure. I'm sure. Yeah. And people get sensitized to things, right? Well, I put my credit card information out there. How bad could it be to put my genetic information out there, you know?
But do these folks know the downside? Perhaps an insurance company will deny them coverage?
Oh, they know they were like paranoid. You know, when you talk to them in interviews, they would come up with things. I said, what would you be concerned about? And some of them would come up with like things like that were completely unrealistic. Like, I'm concerned that what if somebody goes in and genetically engineers my genetic information and creates, you know, bioterrorism and, you know, just really out there things they were concerned about. So they saw the downside, but ultimately it was outweighed by sort of.
It's bizarre.
And these were patients who were sick, who were very invested in making sure that research happened so that future patients could benefit and not go through what they were going through.
They had limited life expectancy.
Some of them had limited life expectancy. We did find that those, so the ones who tended to have more limited life expectancy were adults. We also talked to parents of children who were sick. The parents of children tended to be more worried about their children's future privacy. And what we saw there was that people weren't so concerned about their privacy today. They didn't think much would happen if their genetic information was out there today. But it was, well, you never know what the technology is going to be like and what could happen in 30 years from now. And so people with kids were particularly concerned about, well, if my child, you know, in 30 years from now, how are they going to be affected by my decision today?
It sounds like there's a lot of fear, you know, and properly. Have there been any actual legal cases where people have had their privacy invaded, either by an insurance company or some friend released it?
Yeah.
Has it?
Very, very few, if any, documented cases of actual discrimination based on genetics. And it's not clear whether that's because these are hard cases to win or whether because it doesn't exist. But there is very little documented examples of actual discrimination. There is a lot of public fear about discrimination.
Yeah.
And I actually think that's more important because that's what influences people to get, you know, whether they're going to get tested or not, whether they're going to participate in research or not. It doesn't matter if it actually happens. If they're frightful of it, it might dissuade them from doing things that are either in their health interests or that are good for society, like participating in research.
Isn't this kind of the question, you know, the hypothetical question? If you could find out the day you're going to die, would you want to know it ahead of time? And almost no one does. Isn't that sort of part of the, you know, we think it would affect everything we do in our life when actually it might be valuable information.
Yeah, but I think that's a good analogy, except for that the vast majority of information you're getting from genetics is not that clear. I mean, it's not giving you a date you're going to die. It's not even giving you whether you're going to get. I mean, there's very few diseases and conditions that are inherited in a way that you know you'll get the disease if you have the mutation. Most of it's risk information. So.
Okay, good.
Is it not the case that the neighboring genes influence each other so that the neighborhoods, and that's fantastically complicated to work out.
It's not just the neighboring genes, but there's a whole field of research now on the microbiome. So all the bacteria that live in and on our bodies influences our genetics and our predisposition to health and disease. It's our environmental exposures.
Toxoplasmosis.
Huh?
Toxoplasmosis.
Yeah, so I mean there's so many other factors that go into whether you actually get a disease, whether, you know, how you respond to that disease, et cetera, that it's really difficult to distill it down to sort of just genetics. But it's certainly a piece of the puzzle, and a piece of the puzzle that up until recently we haven't had much insight into.
I understood before I came here that there are a lot of imponderables and a lot of uncertainties, and you've made it clear to me why they exist. I think one of the most fascinating things about your talk was the recency of the technology converging with social networking, which is itself a very recent phenomenon. So So I wonder, how much do you think you're going to be spending your intellectual capital keeping up with changes in technology which change the framing of some of the clinical and ethical issues you face? Or am I exaggerating it significantly?
No, I think you're right. We actually have a research project that we're hoping gets funded. It hasn't been funded yet, where we would be looking at sort of what are, not just the technology, but what are going to be the business models for delivering this information. And they are probably going to be very different from what we traditionally think of as traditional models of delivering health information, because there's a vast amount of data that needs to be mined, that needs to be stored, that needs to be interpreted at varying different levels, and that interpretation is going to change rapidly over time as the science advances. And so the business models around sort of how this industry is going to develop, I think, is going to change very, very rapidly. And so we're interested in looking at sort of how do our current very sort of fixed regulatory schemes, how will they accommodate those business models, and do they accommodate them, or do they need to be changed? So yeah, I think the technology is really a big part of what's driving this whole field. And as the technology changes, the implications of it certainly change.
One of the things I understand is we hope, if you have a bad gene, we will be able to go in and correct that, either give you a good gene, do something. Mm-hmm. And of course that met with disaster, as I understand, in Pennsylvania. Is this part of your area of expertise or study, the impact of physicians going in, or whoever would go in and change the genetic code for individuals?
So I haven't done a whole lot in terms of gene therapy. It is a big field. It's a very controversial field. There have been small steps forward in gene therapy. I think more where we're at now is trying to understand the impact of different genetic variants on health and disease. I think the ways, instead of changing genes, what we're doing is we're changing sort of treatments based on genetics, right? So there's a very large, probably the low-hanging fruit in this area is a field called pharmacogenomics. And it looks at genes that tell you how you respond to different medications. So some people who have different genetic variants may metabolize certain medications more quickly or more slowly, and it tells you sort of they may respond to different chemotherapies differently, and that can help sort of tailor your treatment more. I think that's sort of where we're at in terms of clinical application. There is a big field of gene therapy, and it's not one that I have really been that engaged in, and it has been somewhat very controversial for some of the reasons that you mentioned, some bad outcomes in some of the clinical trials.
Yeah.
But those were whole genes. Those were not just blocking.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Well, thank you.
Well, thank you very much.